here. Hello. Okay, now I can introduce our panelists today.
Sorry.
So we've got, as you can see, now we've got all our panelists. Ali Baskerville is a former soldier turned artist and documentary photographer. She's also the founder of the safety training movement ROAR, which is based in the UK. And she covers gender inequality, military occupation, female identity in the forces, and the long-term consequences of armed conflict. We're also joined today, you've already met Jeff, the IWMF security director, who's spent the last 5 years working with us to support our journalists in the field all over the world, particularly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. He was in the Canadian military for more than a decade. And we've also got Colin Pereira. Colin works on the CPJ's emergency team as the chief strategist on journalist safety. And he spent the last 15 years advising press teams on covering war, natural disaster, terrorism, and civil unrest. So we've got really some of the top experts here today to guide you. So I want to go ahead and start with you, Ali. Thank you for persevering and getting on the webinar today. And I'd like to ask you to walk us through what are the practical steps that the journalists who are attending today should be taking, whether they're a freelancer going out on their own or whether they're working in a newsroom and they're working with a team before they go out to cover a protest.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And hello, everybody. Sorry it took me a while to get online then. There's the perils of lending your laptop to somebody else who changes your profile name as well. Okay. So there's some really simple things to do before you cover any protest. And I would say that demonstrations and protests are in some ways more dangerous and risky than covering other types of assignments because they are unpredictable and tensions are high, emotional tension is high, and also it's very hard sometimes to work out where the threat is coming from. And also when that situation does change, it does happen quite quickly. So the preparation you put into before you go out on a demonstration will help you to kind of lessen the impact of some of those things happening. And so I'm just going to walk through a few of the sort of essential things that I would consider before I head out and cover a protest. And towards the end, Jeff or Colin will be able to add anything to this because I don't have all the answers to all of these things. These are just things guided from experience and from teaching in this field as well. But the first thing to really get a grasp of before you do this is to do some research. Now, I know that many of you on this call will have been already covering these protests quite a lot. You may have experienced covering the Arab Spring, and you might have plenty of experience on the ground covering protests, and some of you have never covered one before. So I'm just going to aim at that layer so that you've got some of the basics that you need to think about. And again, when I started covering these kind of things, I thought my military experience was enough. But actually, when you've gone from quite a structured organization to working as a freelancer, you have to do more planning because you're more likely to be working more solo. So there's a lot more elements that you need to think about. But on the research side of this, I'm going to bring in a little bit about editorial as well. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that to be mindful of how much something has been covered and how many of you are there covering it. Because actually what can happen is that competitiveness that perhaps happens in photography of trying to get the picture can also put us a little bit more at risk. So it's worth taking a kind of macro view of the situation and having a look at who's covering what and where it's being covered. And part of that research also comes down to your identity as well. And also when you're covering a protest, there is a value, if possible, to work in a mixed reporting team. And I mean mixed in the sense of black or white photographers together. And certainly white photographers putting themselves more as an ally to a black photographer if the situation dictates, but also regardless of mixed teams, also having one other person with you. It's a lot harder to cover these on your own because you have to be quite reactionary to what can be quite a volatile situation. So having another person with you, whether it's a writer or it's the photographer or whoever's getting the video, working as a team, not just on the content, but also on your personal safety. So if you can get another person to work with, that's ideal. So again, this comes back to the research side. Is there someone else you can team up who's covering the same area? Is there a local journalist who's writing on this story? Can you go along with them? So it's always strength in numbers. It's better to work in a pair than to work on your own in this particular situation. And as you know, those photographers out there, when you're thinking about the image, you get that sort of vision where everything else is kind of, your situation awareness is very much compromised when you're focusing on the image. So that awareness, that situation awareness that Jeff will come on to in a second, does get compromised when you're covering a demonstration. And you've got very different lines of threat, because you've got a very hostile police and you've got an angry crowd. So those things can change very quickly. So that also comes down to researching the subject of the protest. We know that specifically these protests relate to a significant specific event. So we know what the tension point is. We know what these protests are about. Research the history of the protest too. Research the reasons for the protest, some of the key organisations involved in the protest as well, so that you have a deep understanding of what's happening there, especially if it's a new area for you, if you're working out in a different city, somewhere that you've not lived for very long. Then also do a little bit of Google research on Google Maps and have a look at the area itself. People will protest in areas that will gain significant attention, whether it's like government buildings, anywhere that's a centre of interest. So you can easily look at those on Google. And then from that Google image search, you can then start to look at your routes in and out. And it sounds really simple, but actually when you're in quite a stressful situation, your adrenaline's up, it's harder to make a decision. But if you've looked beforehand and you know that there's a building nearby, whether it's somewhere that's a safe place, somewhere that you can get to quite easily, that can also become a vantage point for you to be able to come back, take stock of what's happening. If there's been any kind of situation, a kind of an emergency point on the ground to get to, if you need to get to it. And make sure it's realistic. You know, can you get to that? Don't put it at a hotel that's like 2 k's away. Make sure it's actually proximate and close to where you are. And vantage points are really good for camera positions as well, so that you don't have to necessarily be in the crowd to be able to get the footage. And that's really important, because if you're working on the visual side, there will be images that you will need to get to tell the story. But think about exposure. So within that plan, think about how long you're actually going to spend covering the protest. It may mean that you only need to go in for 10 minutes at a time. And exposure is really important, because in most protests, it's very easy to get pulled in to the crowd and to become part of the protest. And of course, with the way the police are behaving in the States right now, then obviously you can be targeted as a member of that crowd, but also, and we'll talk about this a bit later, the behaviour towards the press right now is hostile. So therefore, when we look at research, look at how the press are being treated right now, get up to date with all the current news that's happening. And then something that we often don't do is physically and mentally check that we're okay to do this. Now, some people, yes, definitely, you know, they want to go and do it. You might be very early on in your career and you feel mentally and physically okay to be able to do this. But listen, some of us have been doing it a long time, and sometimes our mental resilience is tired, right? And also, if this is a subject you've been covering over and over again, be careful about being driven into these dangerous situations from a place of guilt. And also physically think about this, because it's exhausting covering a protest, okay? There is an element of physical fitness that you need to cover a protest. Think about your range of ability, think about what you need to support that, and just mentally check in with yourself to make sure that you're actually okay to do it. Because like I said, they can be quite volatile situations, things can happen very quickly. So check in with that first. And as you put together, it's called a risk assessment, but I would treat it as your personal safety plan. This is not a piece of, don't treat this as a piece of paperwork that needs to be shoved to one side and forgotten about. See, this is your plan, right? And in this plan, within there, you need to put down your points of contact. You need to know who to call if there is a situation. I would recommend writing that down somewhere, whether having a contact list within a grab bag, very close to you physically. Make sure it's not in a backpack. I think Jeff might talk about backpacks and how they can be also something that can be used against you. But I would certainly get something like a bum bag or a shoulder bag that's close to your body, that has your contact numbers in there. Maybe even write one down on an arm. If you're working for an editor, then you can put that on there as well. I think we're going to have questions about identifying yourself as a member of the press also, because in some contexts that's been used against you. And again, we'll talk about on the ground itself in regards to press passes and lanyards shortly. But make sure also, when I talk about point of contact, what that actually means. Now, your editor will have some responsibility for you if you're working for an editor. And you need to have a conversation with the editor to know what those are, right? So making sure you've got adequate insurance, medical cover, making sure the editor knows exactly what you're doing, when you're going there, how long you're going to be there, how to contact you, making sure they've got all your contact information, everybody that's in the team, and also making sure that they have a copy of that risk assessment. We will put a template into the resources later on after we finish this call. And there's quite a few templates you can get from CPJ, Rory Petrus and IWMF as well. But also I would encourage you to build a network of other journalists and people that you trust before you cover any of this, so that you have someone to check in with whilst you're on it, on the shoot or reporting, and of course when you get back, because it can be a very stressful, high threat environment. And certainly if you get into a situation, it's very good shortly after any kind of traumatic incident to check in and talk it through with somebody as soon as possible. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But rather than doing that afterwards, build that in early on, right? Make sure you do have a person who knows where you are and what you're doing. Also, psychologically, it will help you to feel a bit more resilient, to know that you've got someone to check in with as well, so they know where you're going and what you're doing. I realise I'm going quite fast, but I want to get everyone else in as well. So make sure you've got those points of contact, put them into a grab bag. Make sure you have a grab bag. I've talked a little bit more. Make sure it's close to you. Try not to take a lot of equipment, difficult if you're a photographer, but kind of slim down what you need. Maybe use a zoom lens and maybe a prime. You know, think logically about how hard it's going to be to keep changing lenses over and over again. Certainly in the past, if I've got expensive camera equipment, I have kind of put black tape over the names and the makes and stuff, and just taken it down to one camera body and two interchangeable lenses, because again, it's a distraction if you happen to keep changing your lenses over and over again, or maximum two bodies with those lenses fixed. Because like I said, the more equipment you've got, the more you've got to carry, the more your hands become less able to push people away or be able to make some space. So the grab bag should always be, I would suggest, on your front, near your body. Your equipment should be probably on your back. So keep it close to you. And in there, I would make sure you have a basic first aid kit. Make sure you have snacks, water. Also make sure that you have your phone charged fully and a spare battery for that phone if it's an energy draining phone. Take any apps off your phone that do suck the battery life out. Turn all your face recognition apps off on your phone. Clean down and sanitize your digital equipment. What I mean by that is, if you've got the days before's shoot on it, get rid of it. Because what we don't want to do is have anything that the police could challenge you over, okay? So any of your memory cards, clean them down after each shoot and then put new ones in, or just, put them onto your hard drives. You will probably build up a lot of content while you're doing this as well. And sometimes we might end up having quite a few memory cards on us that have got like a few days shoot on there. But every time you go out, get into a habit of changing it and downloading images. Get those spare hard drives working. Get yourself an extra hard drive as well if you can afford to do that. And also that's the same with your phone. Often you'll photograph things on the phone because you might be encouraged to load to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Just remember the same applies to your camera phone as well. So be careful about what content you've got on there, especially if you've been photographing or filming an arrest. So it's kind of sanitizing your digital equipment before you go on. I know I'm sort of like speeding through this. Is there any questions at this point that I need to pick up on?
We've had a few questions come in, and I think some of these will get into the next section that Jeff's going to talk about around equipment and hiring security as one option. But we should also pause here probably if Jeff or Colin had any additional points on the pre-planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you actually covered pretty much everything. Ali, I don't have anything to add. Yeah.
Colin, do you have anything?
Likewise, at this stage, I don't have anything to add. I'm sure Ali's going to pick up on the other stuff I will add later on.
Okay, great. We're getting a lot of questions just about specific kinds of gear and PPE. And again, I just want to reassure you that is coming in just a moment.
Can I just add sorry Nadine, can I just add about the clothing, because Jeff's going to get onto PPE, but just like your actual clothes, make sure they're loose, fairly nondescript and made of natural fibres, because the more synthetic they are, the more fire retardant they are, and make sure they cover your arms and legs. Don't be going out there in your vest and your t-shirts and your shorts and stuff. Yeah, keep those things covered up. And if you're wearing pads, like knee pads, put them underneath your clothes rather than on top, because the more aggressive you look, the more militarized you look, the more of a target you can potentially become. Okay, I think that's it from me for now.
Yes, for now, that is great. Thank you so much for that wealth of information. And just to reiterate, the resources that you mentioned, we are going to share with everyone who registered for today's webinar after the session today. So risk assessment templates, etc., will all be shared. But now I'm going to turn to Jeff. So Jeff Belzil, for those who have joined as we've been talking today, is the International Women's Media Foundation Security Director. And he is going to be talking us through, now that you've made your plans and you're ready to cover the protest, what to expect and how to operate more safely when you actually arrive.
Great. Thank you very much, Nadine. First, we're going to start with PPE, and then I will try to respond to all the question in the Q&A. I'm going to just share my screen now. Almost visible and do screen sharing. I cannot share my screen, Maria Alejandra. Meanwhile, I'm going to just say a couple of points. Okay, in terms of like...
you should be good now, Jeff.
Oh, I'm cool. Oh, yeah, perfect. On standing. Perfect. Thank you very much. Sorry for that. It's great. Share. Okay. Sorry. Shall you show my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you very much. From current side. Okay. Great. Just going to PPE first. Okay. Great. What I'm gonna give you is like sort of like a gold standard, right? In terms of PPE, and then what you can get like in the next 1 or 2 days, right? You know, in terms of like if you want to have like a real gas mask, and then you know more like the gold standard. I'm gonna give you basically get some advice to get that equipment like until like you're gonna get by Friday, right? Online. And then I'm gonna give you some other advice as well if you have no resource at all. And that's gonna be really for the US context, right? Of the protest, okay? Great, in terms of, it's really simple, right? You need something to protect you against OS gas, which is pepper spray, CN and CS gas, which is tear gas. In the US, they're using 3 gas, and we're gonna see what to do against that. The second one is actually eye protection. That's the main one you need to have, right? Because reporting right now in protests, right, in riots, it's like going to the pinball, right? You know, you could possibly be really injured, right? Because of the projectile they're using, okay? They don't care if you're journalists, right? First, they don't care, and second, especially at night, they don't see you, right? They have what we call a tunnel vision, right? Like horses, okay? Because of their helmets and stuff, and then you know some of them they just don't care, okay? So it's really important to have some sort of like equipment or some improvised one, okay? In terms of flak jacket and Kevlar helmet, right? As right now, what we see, it's mostly projectile, rock, right? Well, I mean, rock and any projectile from the protesters, because they don't really are good at throwing stuff, so you can get a rock. Or and police, they're not really good either at shooting people either. So you may receive as well a projectile. Okay, so it's really important. You have to basically be ready if you were like going to be on like paintball all day, right? And it's more actually more than just than that. So I basically mask, eye protection, and as well head protection. Why? You need to have something to protect your head, right? Because of head injuries. Okay, that's basically the common injury you're gonna get. It's actually the face. You need to protect your face as much as you can. And then identification. Okay, I actually lost 5 minutes of Ali presentation. I had a technical problem. So Ali, if I say something that you actually mentioned, I apologize in advance. Right, in terms of the lanyards, right? The lanyards are going to be the most important have with you. My recommendation in the US context is, I know freelancer, you don't have it, but having a sort of like identification lanyard on your waist, right? Or on your belt. I always recommend to have a belt. It's just easier. If someone grab you, you have, it's actually better if you have a belt. And having a lanyard or your ID press cards there, not inside your back, because if you get detained, which is probably likely to happen, when we're under stress, we're actually losing our fine dexterity, right? Just opening your bag and stuff, it's just easier to showing your lanyards and keep repeating that you press, keep calm, and then keep repeating your press, you know, and I'm going to speak more deeply in a minute. Okay, Ali already mentioned a medical kit. Having a reflective vest is actually really important. Okay, especially at night, right? It could definitely be better. It doesn't mean that the police will not shoot at you, but it's actually I've been working a lot of media actually using it. Okay, in terms of a flak jacket, body armor, you know, like it's gonna only at the moment. They're using like projectile, which we're gonna see in a minute, but any body armor which is level 3A or with ceramic plates, right? It's only like if you receive a projectile, right? But it's always a good thing to have it. Of course, like when you have the big body armor with ceramic plates, it's a bit overwhelmed, heavy, and then you know you're less mobile, right? You know, like if you have any sort of like vests, even level 2, level 3A, which is the soft one without the ceramic plates, it's still good because as right now it could change, but as right now, nobody is using live ammunition. Okay, it could happen if at a certain extent, but as right now we don't see it. So it's mainly the projectile from. Sorry for that, Siren. From okay, what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna just turn to. I'm gonna just put my headphone. That's it's actually for everyone.
Yeah, can I ask a quick question before we go to the next slide in terms of the protection that people should be thinking about for COVID-19 exposure? That question just came in.
Great, awesome. It's part of next slide. Basically, is you should almost that you should be concerned you know, a lot about COVID-19. Okay, why? Because you don't want to be near people who are actually coughing because of the tear gas. If this individual or asymptomatic, right? We know that the particle when you cough can go up to 6 meters, right? That's why, like, if you're 6 meters from someone who's coughing and you have no protection, you could be infected by COVID-19. You don't want to be in a crowd or coughing or anything like that. I strongly recommend that you have, you know, N95, you know, for that. If you have no extra protection, layer of protection, you know, for COVID. I will always say, sorry, can you see me? Yeah, I never.
Yes.
Can you see me, Nadine? All right. So basically what you want to have is N95, right? If you don't have any extra, like these respirators, right? And as well gloves. You still want to sort of like having a, you know, like distance, especially when they deploy tear gas, you know, because of these particles, right? A N95, it's better than a surgical mask for that. And the good thing about the N95, it will protect you against tear gas until a certain extent, right? Because in the respirator that everyone has, which is going to work at 100%, you have a N95 or P100 filter in it. So it will work until a certain extent. We have fellow from Seattle, and then they were definitely more effective. They had a N95 while reporting during tear gas, and then they were actually it worked until a certain extent. Okay, so I make sure to have gloves, N95, or any sort of like improvised mask. Here's the, okay, these dust mask doesn't really work against tear gas. If you only have that, right, you know, it's better than nothing, but it doesn't really work. You need to have some sort of like carbon filter that it work against OS, which is paper spray, and CS gas, tear gas. Of course, if you have, like, the best will be having a gas mask, right? Which is, it needs to be NBC, right? And then it needs to be NATO for the filter, NATO standard 40 millimeters, okay, cartridge. That you're gonna be able to protect it from any gas. The downside of it for photojournalists is because how the lens is, it's harder to take pictures. That will be the downside of it, and it's quite overwhelming. So I will provide you guys recommendation on eBay and Amazon. Amazon at the moment, it's not reliable because of the Defense Act. You know, in the US, and in the COVID-19, it's just hard to get some PPE equipment through Amazon. But on eBay, we can send you actually a couple of stuff. What I recommend is having a respirator. We call it a half mask respirator, okay? This one, okay, what you need to have is called OV, organic vapor cartridge. This one, okay? The OV, okay, cartridge, okay, that will actually protect you, right, against tear gas, okay? And usually cartridge, it's OV, which is organic vapor, right? And then it has usually a P95, N95, or P100. They have both, okay? And that will actually protect you against tear gas, okay? But the thing is, the problem with these is most of the time it's not tight enough. That's why you need to be really tight when using, and you need actually goggle, right? Goggle, basically what you need for goggles, they need to be anti-fog goggles, impact resistant, tight and seal. The swim goggles are good, but the thing is they will not resist to a rubber bullet or 40 millimeters projectile from the police, which is we're going to see in a minute. It's what they're using. 95% of the projectile or these foam sponge 40 millimeters projectile, okay? Just coming back to the respirator really quick. They have two examples that I recommend, right? The 3M 6200 half face piece mask, right? With these cartridge, you guys, we're gonna share you actually the PowerPoints, and you can actually find online. You can have in a day or two, which is there. And then the second one, the same model, but with a different cartridge. We don't have much time to discuss about that, but you guys gonna have the PowerPoint. The second one, it's the Honeywell Nord half mask respirator 7700 or 5500. That is with a cartridge of, remember, organic vapor and P100s. If you have these two, you're good in business. But remember that you need actually goggle. Or if you have anything, you can have some sort of a carbon active filter. This one from RZ Mask is actually the best against tear gas until a really high extent. But you need glasses. Okay, it's really important. Head protection. Look, guys, it's cheap, affordable, and if you order right now, you can have it by tomorrow. Okay, my recommendation: it's bike, skate, multi-sport helmet, or climbing helmet. This one are the best because it's actually covering everything. I wouldn't go with a black one. I will go with a blue or any other neutral color. Because you don't want to look, you don't want like a police or any security person. So any color, gray could be good, blue could be cool, good. In terms of like the bike, you know, like the mushroom type, it's not good enough, you know, for the projectile they're using. It doesn't cover enough, to be honest. And either this construction helmet, it's not good enough. Okay, for this one, you can have it for $25. All right, these goggles as well for 15 to 20 to 25 US dollars. They need to be impact resistant and tidal seal and anti-fog goggle. Remember, that's really important. Okay, in terms of security training, we don't have much time, so I'm gonna try to speed up, but it's really easy, okay? Police tactic or either containment, right? They're gonna be in line until they're gonna go to the dispersal of it, right? Which is they're gonna advance, they're gonna push, right? The containment is a baseline with police, horse, dog, and then they're just staying there, okay? When they're gonna pass through dispersal is they're gonna actually attack forward, right? And that is when it's actually concerning. They're gonna use tear gas, pepper spray, water cannon, even sound cannon. They haven't used yet, but they're gonna use soon. We're gonna see in a minute. Vehicle, dogs, name it, right? That is what's the concern. As soon as you see them advancing, is they're in mode, they're gonna actually attack, okay? And then you can see when the first line are using their shield and their stick to just hit on their shield, it's to advance. That they're in demonstration and they're gonna actually take action. The third element is, we call it a snatching team, okay? They're the ones gonna detain you, arrest you, confiscation of equipment, camera, detention, and intimidation. We're gonna see in a minute. Great, button, right, stick, which is the one they're gonna use to hit you. That's gonna be the main first line. We're gonna see what it's actually really important for you guys in the US context right now. Pepper spray, that's the first line usually. The spread is from 3 to 5 meters, okay? This one is pretty much the same effect that the tear gas, but the difference is this one is in spray, right? And then the range is 3 to 5 meters. The CS gas, which is the tear gas, okay? This one is, remember that it's tear gas, but they're gonna throw a grenade, okay? And as soon as you see a grenade, run, because the radius is 10 by 10 meters, which is they're gonna have the gas, okay? Remember the wind. You have to calculate the wind to know where to go, because if you're going in the same side, the same sense than the wind, you're gonna still have the effect of the gas. CS gas gun, the same thing, but they're using these gray launchers, 40 millimeters riot gun to shoot it. It's the same, right? 10 by 10. It's just the same than the first grenade. They can shoot that thing up to 100 meters, and the same gun they're gonna use to shoot at you with these 40 millimeters cartridge of foam or sponge. 95% of the projectile, that's gonna be that 100 meters. This is basically the foam, right? That's gonna be 95% of the time they're gonna use. It's a foam or sponge. It is not a rubber bullet. They're actually not using rubber bullet that much. They're using only this one, which is they call it less lethal foam marking round, right? They can be shooting by this gun. over here. These projectile, okay, or really dangerous, could be even possibly dead within 40 meters, okay, but they will probably shoot you within 40 meters. It could cause serious injury, especially on the throat and the head. If you have proper equipment, that's gonna actually help you mitigate that. It's less lethal than rubber bullet. The end or sponge round, I've been shot several times when I was in the military, and it's like a baseball bat. It's horrible, okay? So I basically remember 100 meters, have some sort of a PP, and then all the times they try to shoot in the body mass, which is the belt up, right? So if they start shooting at you, and if, try to lay down if it's possible. You see these projectile that can cause, okay? The second weapon they're gonna use against you is paper ball. It's from modified paintball gun or from FN 303 gun. What they're gonna do is, it's like paintball, right? They're gonna use it, and then they're gonna. It's a bit more painful than paintball. The range is 50 meters, right? 50 meters, and how it goes is you get hit, right, and then it's actually gonna release a gas from OS pepper spray. So they're gonna hit on the chest, and then you're gonna feel instantly the gas, that's gonna be impact plus gas. That, you guys, it may shoot a lot of these. The other will be beanbag, right? Beanbag is, pretty much a bit less lethal than a rubber bullet, but the range is 25 meters. Now remember, 25 meters, and they're gonna shoot from these actually shotgun. It's a picture from Hong Kong, but they're using the same thing. It's range 25 meters, the same thing, a bit less threatening than rubber bullet. Okay, I have an issue. Oops.
While you're resolving the tech there, Jeff, we've been getting a lot of questions, and I just want to pause here and take a few of them. A couple of these questions are about whether or not to identify as press, and I want to open these questions to all of our panelists. One is about whether, if you're freelance, you should identify as press, and another one is about this question of wearing black or not. And the question is, an NBC News reporter friend of mine advises wearing black because you don't want to stand out as the press. This is a point of confusion. Stand out or blend in. So pausing here for those questions.
Yeah, look, in terms of wearing black, is just, it really depends. I don't advise it, and then the thing is, like, it really depends of the context. If you're by yourself, like, more likely the threat will come from the police, right? It's why on the context, it really depends. I advise not to wear black, but it's really depend. In terms of, what was the other question?
It was about identifying yourself if you're working alone as a freelancer. And I think Colin also has something to say about this. I saw him turn on his video.
Okay, go. If Colin, you want to answer that?
Hi. So I think you can hear me. I hope so.
Yes.
Great. So just in terms of wearing black, what I should say is we're advising a number of crews and journalists on the ground on an ongoing basis. And I would, like Jeff, I would advise against wearing black. I think, but it really depends on what the other protesters are wearing. So what we're seeing from the data is that the majority of the threat is definitely coming from the police and police brutality. I think we've got probably over 215 incidents logged, confirmed, and the vast majority of those are police brutality. If you are wearing black, the police are paranoid about Antifa, and Antifa tend to wear black. So I think they might confuse you with them or other protesters. So I would wear civilian clothing, but try and just look as neutral as possible. I'm sorry, Nadine, the other question was about?
Well, there have also been a couple of questions coming in from freelancers or small teams. There was a question, sorry, my screen has just like shifted positions. It was about small or student-led news organizations. people, I think that what I'm getting from this is like people who don't have a lot of resources, maybe going in alone, wouldn't have access, for example, to having like a security advisor on the ground.
So I think regardless of what your resources are, I think if you're alone working, it becomes quite dangerous for anyone. But you've got to pick your times, right? And this comes down to your risk assessment. So you've got to look at the location, see what kind of nature the protests are. Looking at the data, it's very clear to us that Minnesota, Washington, and New York are seeing the majority of the incidents, but there are other places like Detroit and Denver that are seeing a huge number of incidents as well. So depending on where you are based, just do some research into the kind of incidents that are occurring, and you can go to the US Press Freedom Tracker, and they have all of these incidents. It depends on the time of day. At night, the risk increases dramatically. And if you are working at night, if you are working in a place with a lot of incidents, then I would strongly advise you that you buddy up with someone or go in a team. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a security advisor with you, because they are incredibly expensive at this point in time. But you need to have an extra pair of eyes watching your back, and just, you know, it's a long day or a long night even, and you get tired and sometimes you switch off. So it's always helpful to have someone with you. And I know there was a question about press accreditation or identification. So you should definitely have press accreditation with you if you can get it. I know there are a lot of people operating without press accreditation. If you are confronted by the police or challenged, you should identify yourself as press. We've obviously seen incidents where that has made little difference, but you should still do so where possible. And I would say you do need to have some sort of press ID or emblem of what, you know, signage on you saying press if you can. Having said that, I appreciate there have also been criminal incidents against journalists and cameras stolen. So you do at the same time want to be discreet, and those incidents have particularly occurred at night. So at night, try and be discreet. But if you're confronted by the police, identify yourself as press straight away.
Thank you, Colin. I want to just also pause to take a question for Ali, if you could weigh in on particular strategies for female journalists who may be working alone in a protest, and what extra risks they should be thinking about, if any.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, in some ways, we never want to differentiate ourselves from the rest of our colleagues, of course. Unfortunately, when tensions are high and emotions are raised, also people might take opportunities as well that they might not have normally taken, especially being close or proximate to you. And again, this comes back to all of the things that we've already said, really, about preparation before you go, research, knowing where you are on the ground, understanding the area well, making sure you've got a point on the ground to get to that's safe. And again, reading the crowd, I think that's a really big thing. And there's a certain, when tensions do get high, someone's behavior may spark other people's behavior. And again, this is about making space and making some distance and being able to get away from something. Now, again, this not just in the sense of harassment or sexual violence. It goes back to something Colin, I just want to touch on there about working alone at night. It's the same applies, really. It is better in these tense environments to have someone working with you who is aware of that and is looking for that as well. So if you can double up as a team, then that's advisable. Also, if you are someone working with somebody who's been grabbed or touched, first of all, just make sure that you support that person and believe that they've said that. If they say something doesn't feel right, I think we need to go listen to someone saying that, because often someone's experience of danger is different, right? So depending on our identity, our perception of risk is different. So if someone who identifies as female is saying, I feel uncomfortable here, and you're a male reporter, then don't try and gaslight them out of that, right? If they think something's wrong, support them. And again, support each other when that does happen, and listen to your gut. Often you will feel there's a good friend of mine who teaches self-defense to women. She said there's sometimes you can just smell fear and you know that something's happening. So trust your gut as well. I know it's a cliche, but do trust your gut. And again, in the context of where you are, this comes back to that kind of mob mentality and people taking opportunities, same as any other act of crime. And we have got some resources as well that we can share with you after this call for anybody who does experience any form of harassment whilst you're reporting, and we are able to sort of signpost you to that.
Thank you, Ali. We're getting so many questions here, and I want to acknowledge we have another 30 minutes allotted for today's webinar. I do want to make sure we get a chance to hear from Colin about the after the protest piece. If we aren't able to get through the questions, we're going to just make note of them so that we can try to put some answers in along with the resources. But turning back to you, Jeff, one of the questions that I think would be useful for you to address, because you've kind of got to this point about where to position yourself in a crowd. The question is, in Denver, protesters are often marching for the majority of the day or the night with no clear direction. And we find ourselves having to move with them with no clear path, and it's easy to end up in the crowd. So what do you say, Jeff, about handling moving crowds and where they should position themselves?
Great. Basically, it really depends if it's at night, during day. You always want to be at like the extremity of the crowd. You don't want to go inside the crowd, or if you want to go in, you're going out by the same way you took, which is the same path. So you want to be at the extremity to shoot. If you're able to have a higher ground vantage point, it's better to shoot. But in terms of try to, if the crowd's going there, you always need to be basically away from the crowd, right? Or if you do, you have to be in the extreme and go there, but remember, you can come back all the time. You're like a sort of like an elastic band. You go in, you go out. You go in, you go out, right? And always stay at the edge, because if you stay inside the crowd, like on the center, you're so vulnerable in terms of anything.
Thank you, Jeff. So I know we kind of paused in the middle of your presentation. Do you want to wrap it up, and then we'll switch?
Wrap it up. For tear gas, what to do if you have no equipment. Remember that the only thing we can actually remove or reduce the gas, if you have any gas in your face, it's using water, right? You need to pour water from the inner corner of your eyes until the outside one. You don't want to pour water on your skin. You want to incline your head and then pour some water from the inside corner of your eye to the outside, right? The second thing is, when you don't wear too much cosmetic, because it can be actually irritant. One more thing about gas. Gas tend to be on the first 4 meters because it's actually heavier than the air, right? So if you were above, and you're gonna be able to get out of the gas. And then it's pretty much that. When you're going back home, don't take a hot shower, because it's gonna open your pore. And then don't wear any contact lenses, right? What you want to do is, why? Because it can actually burn your retina in contact of a gas. What you want, if you have no protection whatsoever, what you want to do, you want to have your normal glasses, but you want to put some sort of like elastic or paracords or any stuff with, to be able to, that if you run, it will not break. It's a safety, and then that it's actually in place. Of course, it's better goggle over anything. If you have if you don't want to, you're actually glasses, like view glasses, you want to wear them underneath your goggle, your safety goggle.
What about milk? Does that work?
It's nothing proven. I wouldn't say no milk. What they've been doing a lot in Hong Kong, Chile is baking soda with water. But to be, I wouldn't recommend it because I never did it myself. I wouldn't recommend it. I would say wind or water, unless if someone wants to add something.
Well, I see that Heidi Levine, who's working in the Middle East quite a lot, is mentioning onions can also help with tear gas.
Yeah, I know, but like, I don't know what to say, to be honest. I heard so many things. They probably work until a certain extent, but I don't want to advise because I never did myself, or I never heard from a doctor that it will actually work.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, I think we're gonna, based on the timing, and because none of us here are legal experts, we aren't going to get into what to do if you are arrested by the police in great detail today, because we want to refer you instead to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which has produced a great guideline on knowing your legal rights around protests, particularly in the US context. And we will be sharing that with you after today's call. They also provide a hotline service if you are arrested. So we're just going to point you to the Reporters Committee. And now I want to turn to Colin Pereira from CPJ to talk us through some of the considerations for after covering a protest, and a little bit more about some of the mental health considerations that we should be thinking about as journalists to take care of ourselves.
Sure. Again, can everyone hear me? I just want to check I'm not muted.
Yes.
Great. So I can't remember a particular time, probably since 9/11, where things have been so stressful in the world. And I am working with newsrooms almost on a daily basis to help them manage their mental health issues because they are seeing a definite uptick in mental health concerns across their newsrooms and across the journalistic fraternity. So I think what helps people, certainly when I talk to journalists, is it helps people to understand what is going on from a trauma perspective. And I'll just give you a quick outline of what happens during a traumatic, when you're experiencing trauma, and also what you can do, some quick hacks to help yourself. So I think basically on a personal level, everyone is different. And the analogy that someone gave me about stress, which I particularly like, is everyone has a cup of stress, right? And their cup is fixed. It's the same size and it doesn't get any bigger or smaller during your life. But the level of stress in your cup rises and falls depending on what you are experiencing at that particular time. And there are certain levels in your cup of stress that are based on your personal experiences. So you will, at any given time, you will have a personal level of stress. And this differs for everyone. So you have your personal level of stress in your cup, which is probably at the bottom. If you've experienced any traumatic incidents in your life, your personal level of stress will be higher than people who haven't experienced traumatic incidents. You will have your work level of stress. This is just the everyday issues of commuting to work, having fights with the boss. That will increase the level of stress in your cup. And what we know is that from studies is that journalists generally have a higher level of stress in their cup than the average member of society because of the kind of work we are exposed to. But at this particular time, we have gone through two major crises for US journalists, which is the COVID crisis and followed by the killing of George Floyd. And those two incidents, I think, are raising the level of stress in individuals' cups near the rim. And for some journalists who have higher levels of personal stress, or journalists of color who have probably direct experience of racism, their levels of stress might be very, very close to the rim, if not overflowing. So I hope this makes sense. I normally have a little diagram that helps me describe this cup. But the key thing about trauma is related to, trauma is when you are exposed to death in some way or form. So that could be either you've been threatened directly with death, or you suffered a serious injury, you've suffered a sexual assault. And it can also be by just witnessing someone else go through these incidents. And what we know for journalists is vicarious trauma is when you are watching trauma from the edit suite, from the social media desk, and you are having to cut footage repeatedly of horrible things. And it's this exposure to death that basically results in acute trauma in people. In America right now, basically, we have been exposed to death very, very fundamentally. So every time you turn on the news, there are statistics about how many people have died from COVID, and I think it's now exceeded 100,000. You know people who are vulnerable and may die in this COVID crisis, or if you don't know people who have already died. That is bringing you closer to this experience of death than anything probably on a global scale that we've ever experienced. And so it's there. It's just raised the level of anxiety in everyone's cup quite dramatically. And in addition to the statistics that we're seeing on the news, we're seeing gun sales soar. We're seeing bad leadership. This is all contributing to a sense of helplessness and being out of control. And then you take the George Floyd murder and what's happening on the streets every day, the violence that we're seeing, and it's really making everything, it's really bringing trauma close to the bone. Sorry, someone's ringing me. I just need to hang that up. So on a societal level, I think we are showing symptoms of being traumatized. And I'm not saying this is like post-traumatic stress. It's not as acute as that for society. There are some individuals who might be suffering from post-traumatic stress caused by this. But there are definitely symptoms across society that show acute levels of anxiety that could spark over into trauma. And basically, I could go into the whole fundamental of what's going on in the brain and the chemicals that are released when you are exposed to trauma, but I don't have enough time, quite frankly. But I think what we need to understand to manage this is that we need some quick management techniques. And basically, a lot of people will refuse to acknowledge that they are feeling anxious or suffering some sort of trauma. And basically, most people, I think, or if journalists are going out to cover these incidents and they're feeling anxious, what we're advising news desks to do is to encourage their staff to carry out a self-checklist every morning before they go on shift or before they go down to the protest, and discuss their self-checklist with someone that they trust. And basically, the checklist is saying, am I feeling up for this today? Whatever your task is, what emotions have I been experiencing in the last 24 hours or 48 hours? And are people around me being overtly negative? Has anything happened in recent days to me that might make me less functional than normal? And if the answers are yes, that doesn't mean that you crawl back in bed and pull the duvet over your head and pretend that it's not happening. It means that you need to take better emotional care of yourself during the day. So if you're a journalist going on shift, we say plan something nice for after the shift. I know it's really hard in lockdown to plan something nice because you haven't been able to go out that much, but take regular exercise, for example. Plan that you're gonna do a long run or something that you enjoy afterwards. You need to think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to rehydrate, feed yourself, and take regular breaks, and ensure that you've got a nice environment to live in if you can. That's not obviously always possible for everyone. And what we're finding what helps people is if they recognize their emotions and label them throughout the day. So if you are feeling particularly stressed, take the time to acknowledge that you're feeling stressed. Take the time to ask yourself, why are you feeling stressed? And it helps people to write it down, actually. Don't just say, this is stress, I'm just panicking about it. Actually try and do a bit of self-analysis and identify what is causing the issues and think about how you can either distance yourself from them or create some space for yourself to just decompress around them. This is really hard, particularly for journalists who are very closely linked to the current protests and the current story, because you're living it. It's hard to say to step back and take some space, but it's a downward spiral if you allow yourself to get more and more stressed about the incidents. So we're also encouraging people to talk a lot to either their colleagues, their friends, their loved ones, and just be open and honest about the emotions they're going through. And lastly, I'll just, I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just stop soon. But the most important thing, I think, is when you're going to go out on shift or you're going to go out to a protest, you need to consider the editorial worth of what you're doing. If you're going to take enormous amounts of risk or you are going to witness horrible things, what are you going to achieve by doing that? Is your story going to make it into the news, or is it going to be left on the cutting room floor? If you are commissioned by an editor, have a serious conversation with that about them. If you are just speculatively going out there, think about the level of risk that you're exposing yourself to and whether it's worth it. And we always have a phrase that we parrot on about, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because, you know, stories come and sorry, I don't want to say stories come and go, because this is a fundamental story of our age. But you know, if you get injured down at the protest, that's going to stay with you for the rest of your life potentially. You know, there's a journalist who's lost her eye covering a story. Maybe she feels it's worth it. I don't know. I haven't spoken to her. But you know, if I lost my eye, I would really want it to be worth it. If I had to have plates put in my head, as I know another journalist who's been beaten by the police has had to do, I really want to know it's worth it, for me personally. So make sure that the risks that you're taking are worth it for you personally. And just lastly, what I would say is, what we know about stress is that it's chemically induced, right? We don't really have control of it. We're built as cave people, and the way we react to trauma is a survival technique, and chemicals are released in our brain automatically. And you don't have control of that. So it's perfectly normal to feel stressed at this time. Quite frankly, if you're not feeling stressed by what we're seeing through COVID and protests, you're a bit weird. So what we know is that the thing that actually counters the chemicals that are causing the stress are other chemicals like oxytocin, and that makes you feel good. It allows you to relax. And oxytocin is released when you hug someone you love, when you do something altruistic, when you do something nice for someone. A lot of oxytocin is released in your brain, and it actually chemically helps you deal with the stress. So I would encourage you to behave in an altruistic fashion if you can. And I don't want to get all zen on you, but you know, even giving money to a homeless person will release oxytocin in your brain, and it will help you counter the stress that you're encountering. So I'll stop there, Nadine, because I can waffle on forever, and I don't want to. I'm sure there'll be questions.
Thank you, Colin. I think that's a really great place to leave the conversation, because there is so much stress for all of us these days, and particularly for our colleagues who are out there covering these protests. I do want to ask if Ali, if you have anything that you wanted to add around trauma and looking after yourself after.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Colin. That was really insightful, actually. And I think it's definitely, right at the start, we talked about the consideration for actually covering the story isn't just one of content, but also about looking after yourself as well, both physically and mentally in the field. And also, I think this there is much talk about trauma as the kind of like the hard end of what we do, but actually there is our general mental health on a daily basis, and something Colin said there was really helpful way of explaining it is to note your how you feel throughout a day, particularly if you're coming up to doing a stressful assignment, but also just generally And I would say that having strategies of self-care throughout your working life will mean that your working life will be more more holistic for yourself. And I think often we feel we're supposed to do the frontline stuff all the time to get some kind of career, and that's not actually true. So don't always push yourself to do the most present assignment, because actually it could be putting you at a lot of risk, especially at the moment with the added and ongoing threat from COVID. So that social connection is quite difficult to maintain because of physical distancing. But do make sure that perhaps you have connections and contacts that are outside the world of journalism. Nurture your connections with your friends and family, people who don't have anything to do with the industry. They're also quite useful for keeping you grounded, and grounding is a really important activity to do, and certainly look at not just hard physical exercise, but even just light exercise, yoga, stretching, breathing. And when you're under huge amounts of stress, the thing that will get you back is breathing. And it sounds so simple, but honestly, when you're adrenalized, you will almost hold your breath. So just remember to focus on the breath. I'm sorry about the noise, but my dog has decided to kick off because she's been sat here for over an hour being quiet, and now she's decided she's not. So get yourself a pet. You can hug those. It's safe.
That's excellent advice, Ellie. All right, we've got about 10 minutes. We've still got a large crowd of people who are on the webinar and a lot of questions. So I'm going to pose these, and please, anyone who would like to jump in, please do. We've got a question from the Seattle Times about planning communication when there's maybe bad mobile service, or maybe you can't use your cell phone at all in the middle of a big protest.
Yeah, what you could do is basically it's either having this two-way Motorola that you can buy, you know, to be able to speak with the one you want to speak, or what you could do as well is having putting a 15 minutes alarm, right? And every 15 or 20 minutes, you can meet at a administration point, right? It could be a corner away from the action. It needs to be relatively closer from the action to be able that every 15 or 20 minutes meeting there, exchanging the battery, speaking up, replanning and stuff, or having this Motorola. The problem with Motorola in cities, in America, is we have a lot of frequency, right? You don't want to be 1-1. You need to be change the frequency at something that nobody's gonna beat. So why bigger the number is, better it is.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, just also we said at the start about noting some spots on the ground. Make sure you know that your editor knows where those are, and arrange a check-in time, and say that if I'm in these, if you don't hear from me within a certain amount of time, I could be in any one of these 3 or 4 areas that you designate before you leave. That's also a good no comms procedure as well.
Thank you. We've also got a question. Oh, sorry, Colin, please go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know how relevant this is any longer, but during the terrorist attacks in London, now going back 10 years, they took down the mobile comms network in London. And we were all issued, I used to work at the BBC at the time, and we were all issued with little bags of coins so that we could find public phone booths and start phoning back to the desk. And we had to bribe people for their landlines and shops and things and ask if we could make phone calls back to the desk. So, you know, landlines still work if you can get into a shop and if they've got a landline. I don't know how many how many old-fashioned
yeah, they removed them all in the US.
Yeah, so it's probably not relevant.
We've also got a question about student journalists, and maybe they don't have a press accreditation, or they're just being singled out because they are young and the police don't believe that they're journalists. What do we say to those students who are out covering protests as student journalists?
Shall I take this?
Please.
So I think that's well, firstly, it's a great time to graduate and be a journalist, I think. Although, so well done for you for sticking with it. I think, what's quite important is that you are able to identify yourself in some way. So if you have a J School ID, that might help you. If you have a letter from, your course director or something like that, that may help you. It's probably not going to help you when you're on the front lines and people are arresting you, because they don't really care about press accreditation at the moment. I think we've all seen the footage of the Vice journalist saying, I'm a member of the press, and they still pepper spray him. But the key thing is, when you are arrested, you want to get out. And so having ID, being able to prove who you are, is very important in terms of being released. So try and get some sort of ID from your school, or at least a letter.
We've also had a number of questions coming in about types of gear, particular recommendations, and I just want to reiterate that we will share a list of recommended PPE. One question I've seen a few times, though, for you, Jeff, is about changing the filter on a respirator and how often you need to do that if you're out working and covering protests.
I respond to all the question basically about PPE. Yeah, it's basically for the others, a respirator. Right, if they say it's 8 hours of, like, if you were in a gas chamber, which is you don't have to change them as often as any other, because tear gas, CS gas, CN gas, or OS gas, they're not life-threatening. That's why you can use them for a good amount of time.
We've also got a question that just came in about sharing your location with an editor or somebody you trust. I think that comes back to the pre-planning and your communications plan, right?
Yeah, part of your risk assessment process. And also make sure that if you're going out later at night, or you're staying up for the duration of that protest, Jeff touched on this as well, about, it's almost like called the flower, where you come in and out and in and out and in and out, like on a rubber band. But if you are going to stay out late into the evening, make sure that editor's actually going to be there to pick up the phone, and hasn't kind of clocked off for the night. So when you do have a risk assessment, make sure it's in the hands of someone who's actually aware of the responsibility of holding on to that risk assessment and is able to answer the phone if you get into a situation with the police.
Flower, I like it. I never thought about that. It's actually flower, right? It's good.
I actually have my whiteboard here to draw it earlier.
Yeah.
So we've also had a couple of questions come in, and today we've really been focused on what's going on in the US right now. There have been some questions that have come in from international journalists who are working. There was a question from India, but about covering protests in places, where there aren't any of these kinds of resources available for journalists. We're not going to have time to have that discussion today, but I don't know if any one of our experts just wants to address that question. If you don't really have any access to, resources, or Colin, I think you want to take it.
Well, it was just about India more than access to resources. But so if you're based in India, we wrote a safety advisory on the CPJ website about covering protests in India. So please go to the safety advisories tab on the CPJ website. But if you don't have access to PPE, which is very common around the world, I think it's a decision-making process about what you will expose yourself to. So protests are they're organic living beasts in many ways, and they're not always violent. So you can safely report on a protest that's not violent without having PPE. But what you need to understand is when the mood is going to change and when it is going to turn violent, and have a plan for what you're going to do when that's going to happen. So you need to understand the visual cues that indicate that things are going to turn violent. And that is often, it is very dependent on how the police are behaving and how the crowd is behaving, and if either party is getting agitated. And what they now know is that, when one party is getting agitated, the other side reacts to that agitation and becomes more violent. So if you notice the police are suddenly wearing body armor, or they're forming up lines, or in India, if they're pulling out the lathi sticks, things like that, that is an indication something is going to happen. Now, it might have been that that was sparked by something the crowd was doing, so someone was throwing projectiles at the police, or it might just be that the police have received an order saying, you need to clear this space. But if you notice the crowd are beginning to get on the police backs, attack them, throw things at them, there's going to be a reaction from the police. If the police start armoring up, and in the US, there are certain units that will be brought in when they're going to do something. So you'll see armored units with shields. You'll see shield walls appearing. In New York, Seattle, DC, you will see police on bikes who look like RoboCop arriving. So depending on where you are in the world, each police unit or police force functions slightly differently. So it's good to research what they do during protests. And it's also good to understand police tactics. So most police forces hopefully get some sort of training in riot control. A lot of them don't. And, going back to the US, because that's quite pertinent at this point in time, US police training is done on a state level. It's not done on a federal level. So it differs from police unit to police unit. And some of them get very poor training and others get very good training. So it depends how well your local police force have been trained, how they react to protesters. And a lot of the time it's about investment in kit. So while the US police force have bought and militarized with tons of weapons, they also haven't bought very good communications kit. So when they're wearing a helmet on the front line, they can't actually hear what's really going on. They don't have, for the most part, they don't have radios in their helmets. So the way they police is they look at what their colleagues are doing next to them and they copy what their colleagues are doing. So if you have a rogue police officer on the front line who suddenly hits someone, suddenly the whole front line might start hitting people, right? That doesn't mean they've received an order to do that or they're doing anything. They're just copying each other because they can't speak to each other properly and it's loud. And so you need to understand how the police actually police protests, and it's different for every police force in the world.
Thank you, Colin. That's a scary thought. I want to close. It is 12:30. I want to thank our panelists and experts today. I want to thank Ali, Colin, and Jeff for being here. This has been super valuable, and I hope it's been a good use of your time. I want to cite a few resources. Both the IWMF and CPJ run emergency funds. So we do emergency assistance for journalists in crisis, and that's not just in the US. So if you have been injured in a protest, if you need support related to the work you're doing right now, please reach out to us. I also want to point you to a Culture of Safety Alliance. Both of our organizations are a part of it. It is an umbrella group of all the press freedom organizations and a lot of newsrooms who are working to improve and to create a culture of safety for journalism. We can send their website as well. They have a great set of safety guidelines, particularly for any editors who are listening today. If we didn't get to your question, we will try to do so afterward. We will also share with you the resources that were mentioned today. And if you need additional help, so if you work for a newsroom that would like a customized safety training, we can help with that too. So please do reach out. This is the reason that IWMF and CPJ exist. It's to enable journalists to be able to tell their stories and to work as safely as possible. So we're here for you. We see you. We thank you for being essential frontlines workers, and we hope that you stay safe and well in your reporting. Thank you, everyone.